We are now going to keep the conversation going with our second panel, and I love the title of this panel, The Fierce Urgency of Now. I think about Dr. King all the time when I think about the things we aren't doing. So I would like to welcome Teresa Weatherall Neal to the stage. She's worked for the Grand Rapids Public Schools for 42 years. Started out as a student worker as a teenager and has worked in numerous capacities throughout this district. And I'd also like to welcome Dr. Nikolai Vitti, Superintendent of the Detroit Public Schools Community District. In his first year, he is working with an elected school board to change, no, not change, but transform how our district works. Hello, how are you?
Good.
Well, this is a power panel, and I want to repeat just one of the questions that I asked of Mr. King, and it has to do with what needs to happen in a big way to change what we have sort of sat and watched for the past 50 years. We know what the problems are. We talk about them every year. We write news stories about them every year. We have studies about them every year, and then we wait until the next year to talk about it again. What needs to change first, literally, for this to become our new reality?
So if I could start, I think two things. One, we need to stop blaming each other. I think that we have gotten so focused on small issues and placing blame, whether it's a charter, a public, a non-public, a union, a non-union, teachers versus administrators, parents versus school systems. I think we need to stop that conversation. I think that's the wrong conversation. Because while we're fighting each other, there are people running off really with the prize. And so our students are suffering. I think that's one. I think the second thing that we need to change is our ability to see those children that we are so blessed to serve, right, differently than we see our own. Both of my grandchildren attend the core urban schools in Grand Rapids Public Schools, right? So I know if they're getting it, everyone else is. Right? So how do we do that? How do we truly, truly put our most valued treasures in the very schools we're talking about?
Thank you. It's great to be on this panel. I look forward to the conversation. I'll try not to repeat what was already said. I agree with the first comments. I would say resources matter. And you know, often you hear K-12 public educators talk about more resources, and then you see the rolling eyes of a legislature, commonly a Republican legislature, roll their eyes to that. And I'm not trying to be partisan, and I agree with your comments, but it does take funding to educate children, and it takes more funding to educate those children that enter the educational space with more challenges. And we just have to be realistic and confront that and say that. I think our educators do a lot to stretch a limited amount of dollars. And then when you have that pilot money, when you have that grant money, and you can see that investment and the impact it has on children, I always say to myself, whether I was superintendent, principal, teacher, imagine what that would look like scaled with the 10 children that are benefiting from that extra investment, those extra resources. So resources, but beyond that, it's something that I heard Dr. King say as I was walking in, which was you have to take the profession of teaching seriously as a country. The most important people that are having an impact on children every day in the K-12 space is the teacher in the classroom. That's the epicenter of reform, is the classroom. And we as a country devalue that profession. How do we do that? We don't make college free for those people who are willing to go into teaching. We don't allow ways of paying off college debt if you go into teaching. We don't inspire our most ambitious undergraduates to go into teaching based on the pay that they receive after teaching, and other professions are better paying. And then the conditions. We fit multiple students, too many students in one classroom that are below grade level. We don't provide the right kind of training, even the college experience. We don't allow for mentorship to happen in residency programs for teachers. You know, if we have the ability as a country, and although it's privately funded, to ensure that doctors have time and space to learn how to do surgery, where they shadow a master surgeon. They have space to ask questions and make mistakes. If we can do that for a surgeon, and we know how important that is, what's more important than teaching a child how to read? So why don't we apply that same model to those individuals that are going to teaching? So I'll focus on that as far as big picture, is if we got the teaching profession right, and there are so many talented people that are already doing it, but it's in isolation. It's not scaled. And if one investment was made is encourage the next generation of our most ambitious, talented undergraduates to go into teaching, you would see the impact, because children are gifted and talented. They just need to be inspired to show that work, and that happens through great teachers. And we all can testify and remember that great teacher. But now take that one teacher and take that teacher from kindergarten all the way to 12th grade at scale, and imagine what our children would do then.
One of the things that we've spent a lot of time talking about, particularly over the past year, is equitable funding versus equality. There is no equality in any public school right now, so let's just focus on equitable funding. Should urban schools, just as a rule, get more resources and funding than other schools? This is not, you know, anything against suburbs or, you know, property taxes. It's just, if you know that you have more that's needed, then you know you need more resources. I mean, it's kind of a no-brainer. So why do we not talk about that as a reality?
Well, I'd say two things. One is, I think, how we design school funding should be based, as you suggest, on need. We know low-income students need more. We ought to spend more on low-income kids. We know English learners need more support. We ought to be spending more for our English learners. We know that students with disabilities are going to need additional supports. We ought to be spending more. And if we think about it in that way, we will direct equitable resources. We will direct resources to those who need them the most. The second piece, and this is a harder thing for us to grapple with as a country, is that we choose, unlike most of our international competitors, we choose to organize our schools in a way that concentrates the kids with the greatest needs in a subset of schools. We actually don't have to be organized that way. We've made that choice, right? We've made that choice both around how we design school districts, how we design attendance zones for schools, and how we design housing policy. But what we know is that that means those schools are then awash in challenges, as opposed to if we had an approach where we tried to create schools that would draw a more racially and socioeconomically diverse population, where you wouldn't necessarily have schools that are so overwhelmed by those challenges, and you'd have the benefit for our civic culture of kids getting to interact positively with peers who are different from them.
I'd like to add to that, because we'll say we've put more money in public education, right, than we have in years. It doesn't come from grant funds, right? We need to fix the formula, because there is no one size fits all, right? We talk about teacher pay. You can't expect teachers to spend 9-10 hours a day, right? And yet they are paid 20-30% lower than teachers just 6-7 miles in Kent County, right? And so how do we fix this so it's not just a Section 31A or not just a Title I or IDEA or whatever it is, but that you actually fix the base funding? And you have to do that by collaborating with our teachers union as well as the business office. Right? So it's a both and. We restructured in Grand Rapids Public Schools, as part of our transformation plan, we restructured our teachers' pay with the union, right? And so they decided how to spend dollars. We have to open up the books and continue to fight. And there's also our School Finance Research Committee. We know for a fact that many of us in this room are working with, but we all need to join that. There is no one size fits all when it comes to funding. And we can't say that we'll fix that with a grant dollar, because that's going to go away, right? Fix the base.
Let's talk charter schools. So when you're looking for innovation, you're looking for some way to make things better, and someone like Albert Shankar says, well, let's just have some schools of choice and try to give parents something different. Charter schools were designed initially, ideally, as a way to provide competition, as a way to elevate public schools so they would rise to do what charter schools would do. And as we know, not all charter schools made the grade. Not all charter schools did that. But as we're moving forward and as we're continuing to talk about improvement, is one of those routes to improvement continued charter schools? And if so, what needs to make them better so that they can achieve what they were supposed to achieve? Yes, I'll start with you.
Every panel, I can't avoid the charter question. If we just want to get it right for 50,000 students in DPSCD. But I think you have to obviously talk about this issue. I think, you know, the charter movement across the country varied depending on the state, and that had to do with the right policy at the state level. So, you know, there are good charters throughout the country. There are good charters in Michigan. There are good charters in Detroit. But to answer your question directly, I don't think the charter movement is the at-scale approach as far as the solution. And I think that has demonstrated itself nationally at individual states and specifically in Detroit. I think Detroit probably is what policymakers should use as the example of what not to do. It's a perfect case study. And so why is that? One, there was no regulation as far as quality. Anyone could essentially create a charter school. Two, you destabilize the traditional public school system through emergency management, where leaders were appointed that did not have an educational background, no track record of success or a record of reform, so that destabilized the system. The lack of quality control led parents that are legitimately frustrated. They want more for their children, and they're not seeing it happening in the traditional public school system, so the grass is greener on the other side. They jump the fence and realize in some instances it was better, most instances it's the same, in other instances it's worse. So you just destabilize a city that is already going through trauma of loss of jobs, loss of city revenue, loss of city resources. So you're destabilizing the family, the community, and now you've destabilized the schooling process and system. The other thing that went wrong is there's not much local control with city charters. Charters are authorized outside of Detroit. Detroiters are not on, for the most part, charter boards. So there's really no local accountability. I think what I've learned more than anything else coming in to the system after emergency management is that without a level of local control, so people that are elected by the people, there's a lack of responsiveness and accountability and a lack of ownership of the reform, and that happened in the district, but it also happened in charters. So moving forward, in my opinion, there's a space for charters because they're here, children are there, parents have bought in. We don't need to destabilize it anymore, but we need to create uniform accountability for district schools and charter schools moving forward to say, if you're not improving, what are you going to do things differently? The inputs lead to better outputs, and if you're not willing to do that and you're still not doing things differently, you got to shut down. And more importantly, moving forward, you can't authorize charters based on a lack of a track record. We cannot experiment with children, and we have been experimenting with children, and they have suffered because of it.
That's right. So I absolutely agree, and I think I agree totally. The answer is not to now try to undo what we've done. I think we need to learn, right? In Kent County, we have over 15,000 children in charter schools. They've chosen that. And so now how do we begin to not only hold them accountable, but that's more than just language. When you say hold people accountable, what does the training for teachers look like? What does a pay for teachers look like? I mean, there's this constant churn of people coming and going. That isn't good for kids. And so how do we now work together to begin to fix what we've created? Again, this pitting one against the other with resources. Absolutely, we have legacy costs, right, in public schools. And so when you give dollar for dollar, it isn't the same because we're paying the legacy cost. And so what does the dollar amount really look like when you're talking about an institution that started 20 years ago and one that's been around for 200-300 years, right? I think that we need to get in a room and just really start to look at what are some of these real issues, right? It's bigger than this.
I would just add there are states that can be an example. I mean, to go back to the example of Massachusetts, Massachusetts has a very strong, high-performing charter sector. They did the things that Superintendent Vitti described, right? They set a high bar to get a charter. They have rigorous oversight. They're willing to close low-performing schools. New York State has rigorous charter oversight. Some of the charters in New York City are among the highest performing charters in the country. Again, it's because of what is in state law. And, you know, Ed Trust Midwest for a decade now has been documenting the reality that Michigan has a very weak charter law and has weak charter oversight, and kids are paying the consequences of that.
Can I add one more thing?
Absolutely.
And I think it's important for the audience and those that may be listening, is in Detroit, just like a lot of urban centers, you have a lot of transiency. But in Detroit, it's even more profound, where we're seeing in some schools over 30% of students moving from one school to the other. And one of the results of, one of the reasons for that is this, this Wild West approach to choice, where parents even, when they're having their children, it becomes, well, I have a challenge with this teacher, so I'm going to move my child to another school, or my child should have been disciplined for an issue and is moving to another school. That just creates more instability within the community, and that negatively impacts the child. I would also say, let's use actual data to have this conversation in Detroit. We've had scaled charter reform. 50,000 students in Detroit are in charters, about 50,000 are in DPSED. So over the past decade, we've had this idea of scaled reform, and we haven't seen much difference. There are individual charters that do better than traditional public schools. There are traditional public schools that do better than individual charters. In the aggregate, there's not much difference statistically between the two as far as performing at grade level. So I think the conversation of that is the silver bullet has now been debunked. So let's move forward. Let's support the good schools in both systems and expand that. And let's try to create more stability in the city so children can have what we think of as a traditional education.
Earlier you mentioned blame, the blame game, where different people blame different factors. Or one of the things that's true, not just in Detroit, but I focus a lot on Detroit because that's where all of my kids are. People like to blame parents. I get letters every week as a columnist from folks saying, I don't want to support DPS because the parents are not doing what they should do, or and what they don't hear themselves saying is, I don't care about those children because their parents aren't doing what they should do, when, quite frankly, I know and meet these parents who adore their children, want great things for their children, are working 3 jobs to make sure their children are having food, and so they may not be able to go to a parent-teacher conference all the time, or they may not be able to do these other things that they're trying to do. I know in Detroit, you have everything from parent academies, which are awesome, to the Detroit Parent Network, which does some things. But the bottom line is there's still a greater need. If we're talking about moving forward and changing the paradigm and changing how we help families, Detroit education, just like in other urban districts, has to be different. So how do we get to the point where something like wraparound services, I even hate that phrase, sorry, is not optional, but is something seen as necessary to make sure those kids get the same education as other kids?
One, it goes back to funding, right? And so, so I started in Grand Rapids about 17 years ago, the whole idea of bringing the community in. And I think that onus is on the community and not on the children. Parents do want what's best for their kids. I've been in the system a long time, right? I'm a product of Grand Rapids Public Schools, 10 brothers and sisters. We're all educated. My parents didn't have an education, a formal college education, but they did care. But my mother couldn't walk up to the school, right? And so I think if we start again just assuming, right, that these parents want what's best, we look at this differently. But I also think that leadership is important, right? So it depends on who we put in these seats. It depends on the superintendent. You have to look at the data. When you see that these children are being put out for small reasons, disaggregate that data, right? Look at the classroom. Is it happening in research? You need to call parents with information, but don't call them every day with blame. Or as kids say, my mother don't pick up when it's 819, right? Parents don't want to hear that every day. But until we begin to look at the data and do something about it and call and say, you know what, good job, right? Your child, then we can begin to turn this around, but assuming that it's good. In Grand Rapids, we've partnered, we have Parent University. Over 13,000 parents have taken classes. They've chosen which classes we should offer. Parents do want what's best, right? And it isn't measured by parent-teacher conference, sorry. It just really isn't measured by things like that.
Two things. One is I don't think we can put this all just on schools.
That's right.
There's a question of what we're doing as a community. If you work 3 jobs, you shouldn't be struggling to pay your bills.
That's right.
But we have people in that situation. We have people who are making the choice between their prescriptions and food. Right? That's about how we organize our broader society, and of course that has consequences in schools. So I think we have to have a broader strategy about how do we make people's lives better in the community, and schools will benefit from that, kids will benefit from that. So I worry sometimes that people imagine the school doing everything and we'll just ignore the other problems in our society, and we have to tackle those. The second piece about schools is we really should follow the evidence. There's a shocking study done at Johns Hopkins University. They found that if students can't see the board or read the book, they do worse in school. Shocking, I know. And then they had an intervention. They did vision screening, and kids who needed glasses got them. They assessed performance, and they found, again, quite shocking. If you can see the board or read the book, you do better in school. And so I make light of the study, not because it wasn't a rigorous and good study, but because it's so absurd that we don't act on that evidence. But there are kids today in classrooms in this city and throughout the country who are failing in school because they literally can't see the board or read the book. It doesn't have to be that way. And so we ought to follow the evidence and provide kids the supports they need so they can be successful.
So just to build off that point, the example of the glasses, we can apply that to mental health. We can apply that to being hungry. So completely agree, these are socioeconomic challenges, many of which are linked to a history of racism in this country that still have not been addressed, and all of that manifests in our children that come to school every day. And then based on your political ideology, you frame an argument to say, well, the schools are failing children. Therefore, we're going to defund the initiative, which is K-12 education. And then we have that conversation. And then what's happening in this country is it's as if the village is all going to this well, and the well has very little water. And the village is the country in general. And then we all become territorial about who gets the water, when, or how much. So if with a little bit of water, well, the suburbs need to get this, and well, the urban schools need to get this, the rural districts need to get this. And what's happening right now in this country, especially nationally, is this divide. And the historical differences that existed are coming more to light, and people are indifferent about now saying it out loud even though they thought it. But I go back to the letters that people write, and I see the same thing, but there's just a deep level, and I'm unapologetic in saying this, is ignorance. There's an ignorance with not knowing what it's like to be poor. It's an ignorance to not knowing what it's like to be trying to carry 3 jobs. So when people say parents don't care or that mother doesn't care, just for 1 second, please, go to that person's house, see it, know what it's like to be stressed about getting from job to job, not having a car, feeling your house is the power is going to be turned off in your house, that your child is sick, you can't go to the doctor, we can go on, and then tell me that the parent doesn't care. Because sometimes the parent's care is getting the child up and going to school. And we're even challenged in that space. So that isn't a Herculean effort to just say, you're going to go to school every day. And that the child is even focused somewhat on school, considering everything else is going on. So there's just a profound ignorance when we say parents don't care about their child's education. There's just an ignorance in not understanding the reality that parents face. And then there's an ideological justification that goes along with why we don't fund, why we don't support, because you have to justify the fact that you're neglecting a generation of children.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. The great shame for some districts is that there are amazing innovations that are happening in education. There are all types of things, everything from robotics to classroom techniques, just all kinds of stuff. I somehow keep feeling, particularly here in Michigan, that we're missing out on some of those things because we're always so busy playing catch up, whether we're trying to catch up on reading or whether we're trying to catch up on standards. When I got here 18 years ago, we didn't even really have high school graduation standards. 75% of Michigan residents didn't think that a college degree was necessary for life. So there have been great change. Those things are different now, thank God. But we seem to be missing out on some of those things because we're here while some other districts are here. Name one innovative thing that you think would be awesome that all school districts should be doing, that as we're moving forward, even as we're trying to catch up and even as we're trying to provide those other services that should be necessary and that we ought to make necessary for kids, that we ought to be doing, that this is just something that should be standard, that this is what we ought to be doing in public schools for all children.
Wow, that's a huge question. And I think what I would like to see is, instead of gifted and talented schools or programs, let every school be a gifted and talented. And if we taught as such and trained teachers, whether it's IB standards or whatever that is, I think we get a different outcome, right? What we found we were doing in Grand Rapids is we mailed home to say your child should be in AP class or whatever. Well, once we peeled the data back and started looking at it, people weren't responding. We took that as you didn't want AP, when that wasn't the deal, right? If you schedule the class, put the students in, give them the support, amazing, right? 40% of our kids in our city middle high, which is ranked 82 or 83 in the country, with the highest test scores, right? Once we removed the teacher recommendation, we removed the names of the kids, and we just said, let's just go based on test scores, right? And that was an initiative that I did years ago, but received pushback. Guess what? Those kids are doing fine now, right? All of a sudden, they're doing fine. You just remove the name, right, and go based on test scores. And 40% of those children are poor. And they're doing great.
Quality pre-K for 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, right? If we create that strong foundation for kids, it's not just an academic foundation, but it's also a socio-emotional foundation. We will see the long-term benefit, not only in their K-12 performance, but in their success in college and careers.
So I struggle with your question a little bit because everything has become about what is innovative, what is new. And I just, there's, whether we're talking about research, whether we're talking about what practitioners see works, let's just go back to doing what we need to do to create a K-12 experience where we treat children as children. And I know that sounds simplistic, but we don't. From recognizing that everyone is not going to get it the first time it's taught, right? Whether, especially with reading. Reading is a profound process for the brain that human beings have only been doing for a short part of time of our existence. And not everyone's going to get to the right time, so how do you create different pathways? How do you use multisensory approaches to teaching reading? Beyond that, so back to my earlier question about supporting the preparation of teachers. So the Marygrove initiative was launched here, and I think that's something innovative, but in many ways it just goes back to how we should be supporting teachers, which is you take a master teacher, a veteran teacher that's seasoned, experienced, and wants to grow beyond the classroom but doesn't want to be an administrator. You take undergraduates that are learning to become teachers, you match them, and you allow that undergraduate to learn under the tutelage of that master teacher. So they have a whole year to learn, to grow, to make mistakes, to ask questions. I think that is going to be one of the most important initiatives that need to be scaled as we rebuild the district. We have to create a pipeline of teachers that are properly trained and supported and valued to go into the profession. Not necessarily innovative, something that we used to do that we lost sight of. And I'd like to go back to that. And the last point about innovation is truly teaching new teachers how to teach children how to read. And most importantly, ensuring that every elementary teacher, especially, is trained in Orton Gillingham, which is multi-sensory approach to literacy. Because children need to use not sound and sight, but also tactile kinesthetics to learning how to read, to get all the neurons moving and connected, which doesn't always happen for all children, especially those with special needs. And so those are just some simple things, but let's just go back to what we know works. Last point, because I want to get it in. Why is it that educators always say we need more funding and more resources, but non-educators don't? And I just have to say this out loud, and I don't wonder, it's because you see the need and potential of children. So you're working with them every day, you see their beauty, you see their challenges, and you say, man, imagine if I could have this or that to fill these gaps. It's the non-educators that tend to say, we don't need that funding, because they don't see the potential and the outcome and then the results that happen with the right support.
Yeah. Please. Three little things for our listeners and viewers. If you could just quickly talk about the Marygrove experiment. You mentioned that, so for somebody who may not know what that is in a sentence.
So Marygrove has been a staple in the Detroit community. It has struggled with enrollment at the undergraduate level. So DPSCD has partnered with Kresge mainly to restore the campus, if you will, educationally by connecting it to the school system. So we are launching a new high school, which will eventually become a K-12, on the Marygrove campus. So students would be able to go to the school on the campus. It creates that college-going experience. But more importantly, we're partnering also with the University of Michigan so that undergraduate students and even master students can learn how to teach at Marygrove with a master teacher. And those teachers, after their experience, will go into other DPSCD schools, and we're hoping to replicate and scale that throughout the district so that we can recruit and train teachers the way we should in order to give children what they need every day.
Yes, that's wonderful. I want to go back to innovation a minute, because sometimes people hear innovation and they think new. So when I was talking about innovation, it doesn't necessarily have to be something new. For instance, is it still true that in the state of Michigan, children do not have to attend kindergarten? That's a yes or no question.
Right, it really is around age, right? And so it's six years old. But if I could just piggyback what you said, we're doing the same thing in Grand Rapids Public Schools, and we have been with universities, right? And our schools have become the lab. We're using summer school, we're doing, partnering with about 4 different universities, and I think that is the answer. But it's also compensating those teachers that are willing to allow people to come in to train under them, right? And so how do you give them extra money, right? Extra resources, which is what we're doing. They should be getting their first bonus check, right, on the 24th, because I think it's important. You're taking this on, right? They're our biggest cheerleaders, And so how do we compensate these teachers that are willing to take either student teachers on in their classrooms or teacher aides in the prep program? So again, it comes back around to resources. But children do have to go to school, right? You can go beyond kindergarten, but it's the age of 6. It's the age more so than the grade.
So let me ask the question the right way. You have to start attending school at age 6. But that means there are 4- and 5-year-olds who could be in kindergarten, who are not in kindergarten, who are walking into a school for the first time at age 6.
I think that is really important, and that's where pre-K, we know the return on investment, right? In Kent County, we passed the millage so that all of our pre-K students, our young kids, can go to school. We have to continue to push that. We have to educate parents. We have to educate grandmothers and community members, because it does start at age 4, 3, 4, and 5, but we also have to connect with childcare. A lot of our kids go to grandma, to auntie, to someone in the community, right? We know those are crucial years, and so how do we start that before they even walk into the school at the age of 4? Universal preschool is the answer, part of the answer.
Well, see, I would think that would be innovative, that once a child starts school at 3, they must continue going to school
That's
until they
right.
graduate.
That is.
So
innovative.
while that's not new, that's what
That's right.
that's what we used to do. So
That's right.
I want to talk a little bit more, because again, we're talking about the future, and we're talking about what has to happen. I'll go back to a question, again, one that I asked Mr. King. What is the one thing that you would do, whether it's your district or whether it's for the American public school system, that would create monumental change so we can get people on the right mindset to treat our children like children and to teach them the way they need to be taught?
So in the Detroit context, I think facilities send a message to children. And so when children are walking into schools where they see peeled paint, where they see tiles that are warped, when it is warm outside and we have to cancel school because it's 100 degrees or hotter in some classrooms, that immediately sends a message to children who know that there are other schools throughout the state of Michigan and the country that are better. So a real simple way, we've talked about the core around teachers, and I didn't add leaders to that as well, but facilities matter. And for those who say it doesn't, you're probably going to school every day in a nice building. And so we have no way right now as a district to address this problem. And that's hard for me to say as a leader, because my responsibility is to define the problem and problem solve. And so this is challenging based on the fact that we're paying billions of dollars of debt from the old DPS, mainly from an entity that was not locally controlled. So I would say something that we have to address long-term is the facilities.
Very quickly, did you want to add anything?
So for us, we did pass a bond, $175 million for that, but we didn't have the legacy costs to take care of that. And so we are able to build new buildings now and renovate. And I agree, I think that's extremely important. But I also think it comes down to the hiring practices and pay. So the teacher, the principal, the superintendent, and others in the system. I think it's getting the right people, supporting them with professional development, but then moving on people that shouldn't be there.
Yeah,
Right? I think it's a both and.
absolutely.
You know, I would say, this maybe to end on a hopeful note, I think that Michigan is well positioned for a grand bargain like the Massachusetts grand bargain that is about more dollars equitably distributed so that they're getting to the highest need students, and a thoughtful approach to accountability and investments in teacher preparation, teacher support, improving the teaching of reading, improving service to English learners. I think this is a moment where the new leadership in Lansing could come together around that kind of grand bargain, and it could be truly transformative.
Well, I do have hope, and I also have my two. One is that anybody who wants to participate in the Detroit Renaissance, whether it's to build a building, buy a building, or do something, should be required to adopt a school. I told the mayor this.
That's right.
And the second thing is, I think every Michigan legislator, I don't care who they are, whether they're elected or re-elected, should be required to spend a month in a school.
That's right.
So
That's right.
Thank you so much to our panel. Please give them a hand. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for all that you do. And I'm going to turn the program back over to Education Trust. I was so thrilled and honored to be asked to participate today.